She had worn that chair before any of them knew the empire existed. Not worn in the way a woman wears jewelry. For show, for proof, for the small satisfaction of being seen. She had worn that chair the way a spine wears the weight of a body. Quietly, constantly, without needing to be thanked for it. But that was before tonight. Tonight, when Celine Vos Harrington stepped through the gilded double doors of the Ardsley Grand Ballroom at precisely 8:47 in the evening, her midnight blue gown sweeping the marble floor behind her like a slow tide, the first thing she saw was a woman sitting in her seat. Not any seat. Her seat. The one at the curved end of the founder's table, where the room opened up and the light fell at exactly the right angle, and the small brass plaque bolted to the edge of the table read, "Built on vision, held by patience." Those were Celine's words. She had written them on a cocktail napkin at 2 a.m, 15 years ago, in a studio apartment that smelled of turpentine and ambition. She had pressed them into Damien's hands and told him, "This is what we stand for." He'd had the quote engraved on a founding table the following year, presented at the company's inaugural gala, as though the words had simply arrived to him on their own, like inspiration so often does for those accustomed to receiving credit. And now a woman in a crimson dress was sitting where those words lived. The woman's name was Vivian Colt. She was 31. She was beautiful in a way that a freshly sharpened blade is beautiful. Clean, precise, and built for cutting. Her dark hair fell in sculpted waves. Her diamonds were real. Her smile, aimed at the man beside her, was curved and proprietary and full of the particular satisfaction that comes from taking something that belongs to someone else and holding it long enough that you forget it ever had another owner. The man beside her was Damien Harrington, Celine's husband, the man whose name was on the building, the magazine covers, the fragrance campaigns, the Forbes profiles, the man who smiled for cameras with the ease of someone born for them, whose voice commanded rooms, whose handshake closed deals that other men only dreamed of reaching. Damien Harrington, visionary, tastemaker, CEO of Harrington House, the $47 billion fashion conglomerate that clothed royalty, dressed film premieres, and had recently expanded into 4 new luxury markets across Southeast Asia. That Damien, her Damien, or rather, what remained of the man she had once loved enough to build a world for. He saw her. His eyes moved across the room and found hers without hesitation. He did not look embarrassed. He did not lower his gaze. He simply looked at her the way a man looks at something he has already decided is no longer his problem, with a flat, bored acknowledgement, as though she were a piece of furniture he had outgrown but not yet bothered to remove. Then he turned back to Vivian and said something low and close to her ear, and Vivian laughed, the kind of laugh that is designed to be noticed. Celine did not move. She stood at the entrance of the ballroom, this ballroom that had been reserved for the Harrington House annual founding gala for 11 consecutive years, this event that she had organized, curated, and structured from the moment it was first conceived, and she held very still. Around her, 300 of the most powerful people in fashion, finance, and culture moved to the golden light. Champagne was passed. Greetings were exchanged in 4 languages. The air smelled of rare flowers and expensive perfume in a low, intoxicating current of ambition. A string quartet played something slow and French near the far window. Nobody noticed the woman at the door. That was the irony of it all, wasn't it? Nobody ever noticed Celine Vos Harrington. And that, as the room would soon discover, was the most dangerous thing anyone could have allowed. She reached into her small beaded clutch and felt the edge of the folded document inside. Cool paper. 4 pages. Words that had been reviewed by her attorney just 48 hours prior. She did not take it out. She simply touched it. The way a person touches a key before entering a door they have every legal right to open. Then she lifted her chin. She walked toward the table. To understand what Celine Vos Harrington did and did not do on that night in the Ardsley Grand Ballroom, it is necessary to go back, not just to the beginning of the marriage, but further, to the beginning of the woman herself. Celine was born in Accra, Ghana, to a father who ran a mid-sized textile trading company and a mother who could read a room the way other women read books. Quickly, completely, and with a full understanding that what was written on the surface was rarely the whole story. Her father died when she was 14, and the business he left behind was modest but real. Her mother, instead of selling it, learned it. She sat in the offices. She asked questions until men around her grew uncomfortable with her thoroughness. She rebuilt the distribution network in 18 months and then, quietly, sold the company at a 300% profit when Celine was 20. Her mother never told anyone how she'd done it. She said only this: "The quieter you are, Celine, the more you hear. And the more you hear, the more you know. And the more you know, the more power you hold, whenever you choose to use it." Celine never forgot those words. She carried them into every room she ever entered. She studied business at the London School of Economics. She graduated top of her class with a concentration in corporate strategy and textile markets. She spoke 4 languages: English, French, Twi, and the quiet, precise language and numbers that most people spend entire careers pretending they understand. She was 26 when she moved to New York to manage the American interests of the Voss Textile Holdings, a modest company that her mother had established with the profits of the Accra sale. It was not a large company, but it was hers, under her name, under her control, structured so cleanly that no outside investor could touch the core of it without her explicit and written consent. She was 27 when she met Damien Harrington. He was a designer then. Not the Damien Harrington of magazine covers and keynote speeches. He was a Damien of rented studio space and borrowed equipment, and a talent so raw and so genuine that it hurt to look directly at it, the way staring at early sunlight hurts before the eye adjusts. He designed clothes the way a poet writes, with feeling first and structure second, and the result was something that moved people in ways they couldn't articulate but couldn't deny. He had vision. He had charisma. He had the kind of face the camera loved, and the kind of voice that made people lean forward in their chairs. What he did not have was money, or infrastructure, or the faintest understanding of how to turn a gift into a lasting enterprise. Celine understood all 3. Their courtship was genuine. Whatever came later, whatever Damien became, and whatever choices he made on the way to success and flattery and other women's attention warped him, the beginning was real. He loved her quietly, and she loved him loudly, which was unusual for her, and perhaps that should have been the first sign of how much she had allowed herself to open for him. She married him in a small ceremony in Accra. Her mother wore ivory. Damien wore a suit he designed himself, and it was the most beautiful thing most of the guests had ever seen on a man. The company, what would become Harrington House, began not in a boardroom, but at Celine's kitchen table, with her architecture and his artistry. She provided the seed capital through Voss Textile Holdings. She restructured the investment as a parent company arrangement with Voss Collective, the holding entity she maintained under her maiden name, retaining a 51% ownership stake. She insisted on it not out of distrust, but out of the kind of structural intelligence that had been handed down to her by a woman who had learned the hard way that sentiment and business must be filed in separate drawers. Damien never asked about the structure. He signed what she gave him without reading it. He trusted her. Or perhaps more accurately, he trusted that she would handle the parts of the operation that bored him, and he simply wanted the design. And so she designed the empire while he designed the clothes. She secured the first licensing deal with a mid-tier department chain when Harrington House had only 12 pieces in its collection. She flew to Paris, alone without telling him, because she had learned that announcing plans invites interference, and negotiated the terms of their first European distributor over 2 days of measured, quiet conversation in a hotel conference room. She built the board of directors herself, choosing each member not for prestige but for competence and, more importantly, for the quiet loyalty that comes when someone knows you are the one who believed in them first. She did all of this without a title, without a business card that said anything more than Celine Voss Harrington, Director of Strategic Relations, a title she chose deliberately, invisible enough to be overlooked, broad enough to mean everything. She did not need credit. She had something better. She had control. But as the years passed and Harrington House grew, from boutique label to national presence to international powerhouse, a strange and gradual shift occurred, not in the company's foundations, which were unshakably hers, but in the story that the world told about the company, and worse, the story that Damien began to tell about himself. By year 7 of the company, Damien had forgotten how the kitchen table had looked. He had forgotten the name of the department chain executive Celine had charmed into that first partnership. He had forgotten the Paris hotel room. He remembered only his own talent, his own vision, his own face on the cover of Esquire with a headline, "The Man Who Dressed the World." He did not correct the article when it gave him sole credit for the company's founding architecture. He did not call the journalist. He did not add a footnote. He framed it instead and hung it in the boardroom. Celine had walked past it every day for 8 years. She never said a word. She simply kept building. The signs had not arrived suddenly. They never do in marriages that end slowly. They had come the way that erosion always comes. Incrementally, almost gently, each small act of disregard so minor in isolation that a woman might convince herself it was not what it looked like, until there were enough of them stacked together that the structure beneath became impossible to ignore. The first sign Celine would later remember with any clarity had come not from Vivian, but from a quarterly board meeting 18 months prior to the gala. She had been seated at the table, her table, the one she had chosen, the one whose members she had personally recruited over the span of a decade, presenting a restructuring proposal for the company's Southeast Asian expansion. The numbers were precise. The strategy was elegant. The risk modeling had taken her 6 weeks. She had slept 4 hours a night for most of those 6 weeks, and it showed nowhere on her face. She had been mid-sentence when Damien arrived late, 12 minutes past the scheduled start, and sat down at the head of the table with the easy, unashamed confidence of a man who has never been required to apologize for his tardiness. He had looked at her, then at the board, and smiled. "Wonderful," he said, reaching for the printed summary in front of him without having heard a word of what she presented. "Celine's always thorough. Let's discuss the core strategy and move on. We have the photo call at 2. There was a silence around the table. The kind of silence that people produce when they have witnessed something uncomfortable and chosen, collectively, not to name it. Celine had paused. She had looked at him. Then she had folded her hands in front of her, continued her presentation in the same measured voice, and added 2 pages of financial analysis that she had not intended to cover, simply because she understood, in that moment, that she was being dismissed, and she would not be rushed. No one commented. The proposal was approved without much discussion. Damien had indeed left for his photo call at 2. That was the first sign. The kind a woman catalogs not with anger, but with quiet attention. The second sign came 3 months later at the Confashion Press event. Celine had attended with Damien. They had arrived together, as they always did, her a half step behind him, by her own choosing, because she had never required the spotlight. A journalist from a prominent fashion magazine had approached them, recorder in hand, and asked, "Mr. Harrington, can you speak to the creative origins of the house? What inspired the founding philosophy?" Damien had spoken for 6 minutes without pausing. He had described the early years, his studio apartment. He said, the first collection, the early struggles. He had used the word "I" 14 times. He had said "we" once, in passing, near the end, referring to the team. Celine had stood beside him throughout. She had watched the journalist. The journalist had not looked at her once. When they returned to the car, she had said nothing about the interview. Damien had turned to her, flushed and pleased with himself. "Good event," he said. "Yes," she said. She turned to look out the window. The French countryside moved past in greens and golds. She breathed slowly, quietly. The third sign, and the one that began to burn differently from the others, arrived in the form of Vivian Colt. She had come into the picture the way women like Vivian always do, through proximity. She was a creative consultant hired by Damien's personal publicist to manage the branding refresh for his fall collection launch. She was talented. She was present. And she was exactly the kind of woman who understood that the fastest way to access power is not to build it, but to position yourself beside it so seamlessly that the man holding it begins to believe the warmth on his right side is his own. Celine had known within 3 weeks of Vivian's hiring. Not from evidence, not from phone records or receipts or the dramatic confrontations of lesser stories, but simply from the way Damien moved when her name came up. A small, involuntary shift in posture. A new lightness in his voice. A quality of self-consciousness that he had never had with Celine, because with Celine he had long ago stopped performing. She did not confront him. She had watched her mother rebuild a business by knowing when to speak and when to let the situation breathe. She chose to breathe, but the disrespect had continued to escalate moving now with a new brazenness that told her Vivian had begun to embolden him, had perhaps even been the one whispering into his ear about his wife's outdated relevance, about the weight of a marriage he no longer needed to maintain, about the future that waited for a man of his stature if only he would claim it without apology. At a private dinner for Harrington House's major retail partners, Damien had introduced Celine to a table 12 as my wife. Full stop. No title. No acknowledgement of her role. One of the retail partners, a woman named Ingrid Park, who ran the largest luxury retailer in South Korea, and who had first come to the company because of the 10-page market analysis Celine had written and personally delivered to her Seoul headquarters, had looked at Celine with a quiet, knowing expression and said, "Mrs. Harrington, it's always a pleasure." The emphasis on always was deliberate and precise. It was a kind of courtesy that carries, beneath it, a woman's way of saying, "I see you," even if he doesn't. At the company's press preview for the new fragrance line, a line whose scent profile Celine had personally developed with perfumer over the course of 4 months, Damien had given a 10-minute speech and thanked by name his creative team, his publicist, his board members, his personal tailor, and his late father's memory. He had not thanked Celine. She had sat in the third row, in a chair she had pulled back slightly from the one reserved for her, a small, deliberate act of self-preservation that nobody noticed. And she had listened. Her face had been still. Her hands had been folded in her lap. Inside, in the deep climate-control vault where she kept the things she did not yet need, a decision had begun to form. Not anger, not grief. Something older and far more useful. Clarity. She began to review documents quietly. During evenings when Damien was at events, she was no longer invited to. She opened old files. She visited her attorney, a woman named Marguerite Sorey, who had known Celine since the early Accra years, and who was one of the very few people on earth who knew the full and exact structure of Voss Collective's holdings. She did not tell Marguerite everything she was thinking. She did not need to. Marguerite had been watching the same slow erosion Celine had, and when Celine arrived at her Midtown office on a Tuesday morning in March with a calm expression and a leather folder, Marguerite had simply made 2 cups of tea and said, "Tell me where you'd like to start." The Harrington House annual founding gala was, in the language of the fashion world, the most significant event of the calendar. It was not the largest, nor the most glamorous in conventional sense, but it was the most weighted. Every seat in the Ardsley Grand Ballroom was known, mapped, and contested. The seating chart alone was a political document, studied and interpreted by those who attended the way diplomats study a treaty. And no seat carried more weight than the one at the curved end of the founder's table. That seat had been Celine's for 11 consecutive years, not because it was assigned to her, but because she had always been the one who arrived first, who understood what every arrangement meant, and who knew, without needing anyone to explain it, that the founder's seat was not about ceremony. It was about truth. She had dressed for it that evening, as she always dressed for important things, not for attention, but for certainty. The midnight blue gown moved around her like water. Her jewelry was a single pair of diamond earrings, her mother's, small and exquisite and real. Her hair was pulled back in a low, clean knot that revealed the line of her jaw and the set of her chin. She wore no perfume except the one Harrington House had made from her specifications, and the irony of that was not lost on her. She had arrived at 8:47, as previously established, and she had seen what she had seen. She walked toward the founder's table. As she approached, she watched Damien watch her approach. His face moved through 3 emotions in rapid, involuntary succession. The first was recognition. The second was a flash of something adjacent to guilt that he extinguished almost before it appeared. And the third was something colder. The look of a man who has already made a choice and has decided the cleanest way forward is to treat it as though no choice was made at all. He rose slightly from his chair. Not completely. A partial rise that communicated the bare minimum of social protocol. "Celine," he said, "you look nice. Not beautiful. Not stunning. Nice." The word a man uses when he wants a signal, to everyone listening, that the woman in front of him has not exceeded his expectations in any direction. Vivian did not stand. She remained in the seat, Celine's seat, with the particular stillness of a woman who has been coached, or who has coached herself, not to flinch. Her crimson dress caught the light. Her hand rested near the brass plaque with a studied casualness that was actually very deliberate. Celine looked at her. Vivian looked back. Neither woman spoke. Then Celine looked at her name card. It was there, white cardstock, gold embossed lettering. Celine Voss Harrington, but had been placed face down on the table beside the seat Vivian was occupying. Not removed entirely, just turned over, as though her identity were something that could be folded away for the convenience of someone else's comfort. It was a small gesture. In another context, it might have been an accident. It was not an accident. Celine stood beside the chair, with no urgency in her posture. Her hands were still. The room continued around her. Glasses clinked, voices swelled. The quartet shifted into something new. 300 people moved and circled and did not look. Or rather, several people did look. The way people look when they sense something is unfolding nearby, but have not yet identified the nature of it. "There's been a seating adjustment," Damien said, smoothly and easily, as though he were discussing a change in the wine list. "Vivian is handling some press relationships tonight. It made sense to seat her here for the introductions." The silence that followed that sentence was not empty. It was full. "You know how these things go," he added, when Celine did not respond immediately. "There are plenty of open seats near the East table." The East table. The table for junior associates and vendor contacts, and people who were peripheral to the operation. The table that, in the language of this particular room, communicated a very specific status, or the absence of one. He had said it with the ease of a man who believed, with genuine and total conviction, that the woman standing in front of him would absorb this quietly and comply, because she always had. Because in his experience of her, Celine was the kind of woman who managed difficulties without making them public, who swallowed discomfort rather than spitting it onto the floor for everyone to step over. He was right about her nature. He was catastrophically wrong about what it meant. From a next table over, no more than 4 feet away, a man named Bernard Ose watched in silence. He was Harrington House's longest-tenured board member. He had been present at the company's founding. He had sat across from Celine in more rooms than he could count, had watched her structure deals with precision of a surgeon and the patience of a woman who understood that a well-timed pause could accomplish more than any sentence. He looked at her now. His expression did not change. But he set down his champagne glass very slowly, and he did not pick it up again. Celine looked at the table once more. She looked at the upturned card with her name on it. She looked at the plaque, built on vision, held by patience. Then she looked at Damien. She did not speak. She did not widen her eyes or press her lips together or perform any of the small emotional signals that announce to a room that a woman has been wounded. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, the length of time it takes to complete a full breath, and what she communicated in those 3 seconds would have been invisible to anyone watching, because it was not in her expression. It was in the lack of one. She turned. She walked to the East table. She chose a chair near the edge, the one with the clearest view of the founder's table. And she sat down. She ordered water. She opened her clutch and placed it on the table with 2 fingers, the way one places a document that will be needed. Then she reached inside it. She touched the folded papers. She withdrew her phone. She placed 1 call. It lasted 40 seconds. When she put the phone away, she picked up her water glass and looked out across the room at the 300 people who did not know what had just begun. Her face was composed. Her back was straight. Inside, something had settled. Not broken, not shattered, settled. The way a final piece of a structure locks into place when everything else has been built around it, and you know at last that the weight will hold. She did not leave the gala early. She stayed for 3 hours. She spoke with Ingrid Park, who found her at the East table and sat down beside her, without invitation and without explanation, and simply kept her company. She ate. She was gracious. She was warm with the people who sought her out, and there were more of them than Damien would have expected if he had been paying any attention at all. He was not paying attention. He was at the founder's table with Vivian, and he was, by all appearances, exactly where he wished to be. Celine watched him once, briefly, over the rim of her water glass. Then she looked away. The quiet decision had already been made. She left her home at 6 the following morning, not the house she shared with Damien, The townhouse on the Upper East Side that was listed in both their names and that Damien had chosen and she had decorated, and that had never quite felt like something that belonged to her, the way borrowed clothing never quite fits. She left from the apartment on West 57th Street, the one nobody knew about, the one that was registered in the name of Voss Collective and that she had maintained for 11 years as a workspace, a refuge, and, she had understood, on some cellular level, for longer than she'd acknowledged consciously, an exit. It was a clean, high space, floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the early light, a long oak desk stacked with files organized by year and category with the precision of a woman who has always known that the day might come when every document matters. A separate room for the original corporate papers of Voss Collective, filed in acid-free folders inside a fireproof cabinet, a small kitchen, fresh flowers from the market on the corner, because she had never learned how to deny herself the small dignities. She made coffee. She opened the files. Then she called Marguerite. Marguerite Asare arrived at 8. She had known, from the 40-second call the previous evening, that this was not a meeting for commiseration. She carried her own briefcase, wide, heavy, brimming with documents she'd begun pulling from the corporate archive the moment she'd hung up. She wore her black suit, the one she wore to court. They worked for 4 hours without stopping. They did not speak about the gala except once, when Marguerite looked up from a document and said, quietly and without drama, "He turned your name card over." "Yes," Celine said. Marguerite returned to the document. "Good. That makes it simpler." What they laid out across the oak desk in the next 4 hours was, in structure and in impact, one of the most precise and quietly devastating corporate maneuvers that had ever been prepared in a private New York apartment. The facts were not complex. They were simply forgotten, or rather, never known to those who hadn't been looking. Voss Collective, the holding company incorporated under Celine's maiden name at the founding of Harrington House, had retained its 51% ownership stake without interruption. It had never been diluted. It had never been transferred. When the company went public in its 8th year of operation, Damien and his executive team had celebrated by floating 30% of shares to market. What they had floated was Damien's 49%, his share, his portion of a company that it structured, or rather, that Celine had structured, such that the public offering was always limited to his stake. The controlling interest was never on the table. It had never been offered. It had never, in 15 years, been touched, because Celine had built the lock before she built the door. She had done so without drama, without announcement, without even explaining the full architecture to Damien, because in those early years, his trust in her had been total and his interest in corporate structure had been precisely zero. He had signed, he had designed, he had grown, and then he had forgotten who had held the foundation while he was looking up. Voss Collective's controlling stake meant one thing very clearly. As its sole shareholder, Celine had the legal authority to convene a special shareholder meeting with 48 hours' notice, review executive appointments, and, where cause existed, recommend the removal of the sitting CEO. Cause existed, it was not the affair. Personal conduct, by itself, was insufficient, and she had no interest in fighting a personal battle in a corporate arena. The cause was a financial irregularity she had discovered 6 months prior, the one she had documented quietly and said nothing about, the ones that had to do with a series of unauthorized transfer arrangements between the company's marketing budget and a consulting firm that, when followed 2 layers deep, appeared to be registered to a person named Vivian L. Colt. She had not gone to the board with this information immediately. She had held it, the way her mother had always held the most important cards, not out of fear, but out of the understanding that the right moment is never the first available one. The right moment had arrived last night, at the east table of the Ardsley Grand Ballroom. She sent 5 letters, not emails, letters, printed on formal stationery, sealed, and delivered by courier, 1 to each of the 4 independent board members, and 1 to Bernard Osei, who had watched her from 4 feet away at a gala and had set down his champagne and not picked it up again. Each letter contained a single request: attendance at a special shareholder meeting, called under the authority of Voss Collective, to be held in 3 days at the Midtown offices of Marguerite Asare, LLP. She did not tell Damien about the meeting. His assistant received a different letter, brief, professional, and technically worded so that Damien would understand it as a routine shareholder review, the kind of procedural event that happened periodically, and that he had always delegated to Celine to manage. He would not be alarmed. He would not prepare. He would arrive, as he always arrived at these things, with the unexamined confidence of a man who had never had reason to be afraid of a room. In the 2 days between the letters and the meeting, Celine prepared. She slept 8 hours each night. She ate well. She walked to the park each morning at a deliberate pace, the city still cool and dark around her, and she let herself think without writing anything down, simply turning the situation over in her mind the way a stone is turned in a hand, feeling for its edges, its weight, its balance. She thought about 15 years. She thought about the kitchen table. She thought about the Paris hotel room. She thought about the 49% man in the Esquire photograph who called himself the founder. She thought about a brass plaque that said "Built on Vision," held by patience, and she understood, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, that those words had never described Damien. They had described her. They had always described her. On the evening before the meeting, she chose what she would wear, not with ceremony, with the quiet, practical deliberateness of a surgeon selecting instruments. A charcoal gray suit, beautifully cut, structure at the shoulders, her hair down, which she almost never wore to business settings, because she had learned long ago that making a single unexpected choice in your appearance on a day of high stakes was one of the smallest, but most effective ways to signal to a room that everything is, in fact, different now. She pressed the suit herself. She hung it on the back of the door. She made chamomile tea and drank it by the window with the city lights below her, and she felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, with faint surprise, as peace, not triumph, not vengeance, not the hot, bright satisfaction of a wound being answered. Peace, the kind that comes when you have finally decided to stop managing the discomfort of someone else's smallness and simply allow your own size to exist in the room. The conference room on the 42nd floor of the Marguerite Isserey building had a view of Midtown that, on a clear morning, extended all the way to the river. It was a clear morning. The 4 independent board members arrived first, then Bernard Osei, who arrived precisely on time and chose a chair that placed him at Marguerite's right hand. He nodded once at Celine when she entered, and she nodded back, and that was the entirety of what passed between them, because some understandings require no language. Marguerite placed the documents at each seat with her assistant's help. 11 copies of the shareholder review package, 11 copies of the Voss collective ownership structure, 11 copies of the financial irregularity report with annotations, each copy bound in the same dark gray folder, edges squared, as precise as everything Celine did. Celine sat at the head of the table, not in a seat that had been assigned to her, not in a seat that she had been offered or directed to by someone else's courtesy. She sat at the head because she was a majority shareholder, because this was a shareholder-convened meeting, and because she had built the table. At 10 minutes past 9, the door opened. Damien walked in with the ease of a man who does not know he is walking into something. He was dressed well. He was always dressed well. It was his one truly reliable quality. In a navy suit and open-collar white shirt, his expression carrying particular boredom of someone attending a procedural meeting he considers beneath his attention. Behind him, and here was the thing that would later be discussed in every corner of the fashion industry for months, behind him came Vivian. She was in a pale cream blazer. Her hair was immaculate. She carried a small portfolio, as though she had been invited, as though she had a seat, as though the world she occupied at Damien's side had a floor beneath it that would hold her weight. She had not been invited. The room registered her arrival in complete silence. The board members looked at Damien, then at Vivian, then at Celine. Celine looked at Vivian. She did not speak immediately. She let the silence in the room like a piece of furniture. The board understood. Marguerite folded her hands. Vivian's step had slowed without quite stopping, and something in her expression, for just a moment, the smallest fraction of a moment, moved toward uncertain. "Ms. Colt," Celine said. Her voice was calm. It filled the room without effort, the way a low note fills a concert hall. You feel it before you identify the source. This is a closed shareholder meeting. There isn't a seat for you here. A pause. Short. Exact. The East table has capacity. If you need somewhere to wait, not loud, not cruel, deliver with the precision of a woman returning something that had been taken from her, and doing so without raising her voice, because she had never needed to. Vivian stopped walking. Her portfolio was in her hands. She looked at Damien. Damien had gone very still. He was a man who had always been comfortable in rooms. He had presence. He had, for 15 years, moved through boardrooms and press events and industry functions with the total assurance of someone who knew he was the most important person in any given space. But something in the temperature of this room was different, and he felt it before he understood it. The way animals feel a shift in the atmosphere before the rain begins. He looked at Celine. She looked at him. She had not stood from her seat. She was perfectly still at the head of the table, with a gray folder open in front of her and her hands resting on its edge, and the look on her face was not anger, was not satisfaction, was not grief. It was clarity. "What is this?" he said. Marguerite answered before Celine needed to. "A special shareholder meeting, Mr. Harrington, convened under Rule 14 of the Voss Collective Articles of Incorporation. Notice served 3 days prior per legal requirement. You were notified. I was notified of a routine review. This is a shareholder review," Marguerite said. The distinction in her voice was subtle but absolute. Damien looked around the table. The board members were already seated, already holding the gray folders, already having read. He could tell by the set of their expressions, already having read what was inside. Bernard Ose met his gaze briefly, then looked at his document. Vivian had already left the room. Celine waited for Damien to sit. He sat. He did not look comfortable. For the first time in 15 years, possibly in longer, the room was not arranged around his comfort. It was arranged around something else entirely. Celine opened the meeting. "The majority shareholder of Voss Collective has convened a special session to address 2 matters," she said. Her voice was even. She did not look at her notes. She had not needed notes for this. "The first is a financial audit, finding related to the marketing allocation of the last fiscal year. The second is a proposed restructuring of the executive leadership of Harrington House, effective immediately upon board ratification." She slid the first document across the table toward Damien, not dramatically, not with a performance of weight, the way one slides something that has always belonged on the other side of the table and is now simply arriving where it was always headed. He looked at it. He read the first page. Something in his face changed. The specific quality of confidence that had lived there for 15 years, that untested, never challenged certainty, cracked quietly, the way ice
It must
cracks
be
at its
held
center
by
before you see it
patience to
happen at
achieve
the
true
surface.
success.
The document detailed 14 months of unauthorized transfers from a Harrington House marketing reserve into a consulting services contract issued to Colt Advisory, LLC, a company registered in Delaware. 2 months prior to Vivian's hiring, sole proprietor Vivian L. Colt. The transfers were documented with dates, authorization codes, and Damien's digital signature on the approval chain. Whether he had known what the payments were for was a question of intent that lawyers would eventually debate. That he had approved them without oversight was not a question at all. The total was $3.7 million. He looked up. Celine was watching him. She had seen this moment coming for months, had rehearsed its emotional texture in her mind enough times that she had expected to feel something grand and final when it arrived. Instead, she felt only the steady, grounded calm of someone doing necessary work. "This is," he started, "documented," she said. He looked at the board. Bernard Ose had turned his copy of the financial report to the 3rd page. The others were similarly occupied. No one looked at Damien with sympathy. Some did not look at him at all. "The second matter," Celine continued, and here she turned to the second document, "is the executive structure of the company going forward. Voss Collective, as the majority shareholder, is exercising its right under the Articles to review and amend the CEO appointment. Effective as of the close of this meeting, Damien Harrington is being relieved of his executive title and his authorized signatory status, pending completion of the financial audit." She paused. In that pause, the weight of everything. 15 years of a company built quietly, 15 years of credit given away, 15 years of a woman made invisible in the enterprise she constructed, settled into the room like weather. You could feel it. Every person at the table felt it. His design role, Celine said, is not being removed. His talent is not in question. This was the only moment when anything approaching emotion moved through her voice. Not sentiment, not softness, something more exact than that. Something that said, I separated the man from the behavior, and I always knew the difference, and I want on the record that I did. Damien stared at her. His mouth was open, not in a dramatic way, just slightly. The way it opens when the words a person had prepared are suddenly insufficient to reality in front of them. He had prepared, perhaps, for a conversation about the affair, for an argument about the gala, for the quiet confrontation of marriage ending. Difficult but familiar in shape, the kind of ending he had likely scripted in his own imagination and found manageable. He had not prepared for this. He had not prepared for his wife to be the room. You can't, he said. I can, she said. She turned the document to face him, and her finger rested on the bottom line. The incorporation date of Voss Collective, the ownership percentage, the signatures, his signature, among them, the one he had given 15 years ago without reading what he was signing, because he had trusted her. She had been trustworthy. The distinction mattered to her, and she knew it had never once mattered to him, and that knowledge was the closest thing to grief she allowed herself in that room. You will receive a full communication from Marguerite's office by end of day, she said. I ask that you allow the process to move without interruption. The company's stability is best protected by a quiet transition. She looked at the board. Any discussion? Bernard Osei placed his copy of the document flat on the table and straightened it with both hands, the way a man tidies the last thing before you leave a room. I move to ratify, he said. The vote was 4-1. Damien did not vote. His vote, under the restructured authority table, had been suspended pending the audit. The meeting lasted 39 minutes. When it was over, Celine gathered her documents. She placed them in her briefcase with the same calm efficiency she brought to every meeting she had ever attended in this company's name. She nodded to the board members. She thanked Marguerite. She did not look at Damien again until she was nearly at the door, and when she did look at him, he was still in his chair, the financial document open in front of him, his hands resting on the table with the empty, unfamiliar quality of hands that no longer know what they are authorized to hold. She did not say anything final. She did not give him a closing line. She simply looked at him for one moment, seeing him the way you see a place you are leaving for the last time, not with bitterness, but with a faint, specific ache of recognizing what has been lost. And then she walked out. The door closed behind her, quietly, as all important things in her life had always closed. The news broke on a Thursday, not because Celine had planted it, not because anyone in that conference room had leaked what was said. It broke because 39 minutes after the meeting concluded, a routine SEC filing was made by Marguerite's office, legally required, publicly accessible and entirely standard in its form, that named Voss Collective as a majority shareholder of Harrington House, and recorded the change in executive leadership. The filing used no dramatic language. It contained no narrative. It was, from a legal standpoint, 5 pages of precision. The fashion world read it like a novel. By Friday morning, the story had moved from trade publications to mainstream business press, to the kind of cultural commentary sections that exist at the intersection of money and power, and the specific hunger people feel when they discover that the world they thought they understood was structured entirely differently beneath. The headlines were loud, even when the facts were quiet. Who is Celine Voss, the woman who actually owns Harrington House? And the $47 billion blind spot, how fashion's most famous CEO missed the foundation beneath his feet. And from one publication whose editor Celine suspected had a particular taste for precision, built on vision, held by patience. And now we know who was doing the holding. The last one made her pause when she read it. She set down her coffee. She breathed once. She did not save the article. She did not need to. The fashion industry's response was one of those rare phenomena that observers later described, with varying degrees of accuracy, as a collective recalibration. People who had worked with Harrington House for years and who had interacted with Celine as a peripheral figure, the CEOs, wife, polished and quiet and present at events without apparent function, began now to re-examine their own archives. They found her fingerprints everywhere, in the language of contracts, in the structure of partnerships, in the market analyses that had consistently predicted with uncanny accuracy which moves would prove valuable and which would fail, in the board composition, in the company's entire philosophical architecture, which reflected not the instinctive, feeling-first approach of designer, but the precise, layered intelligence of a strategist who had spent 15 years building something she believed in. Ingrid Park called on a Sunday. She did not speak for several seconds after Celine answered, and when she did, she said only, "I always knew." And Celine said, "I know you did." And for a moment, the two women simply existed in the same silence together, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Bernard O'Shea sent a note, on paper, with his actual handwriting, an old-world gesture that Celine recognized and appreciated for exactly what it was. "The company was always yours," he wrote. "I am glad the structure finally matches the truth. I remain at your service." She placed a note in the folder with the original incorporation papers. Vivian Colt had not waited for the story to break. She had disappeared from Damien's life with a speed that suggested she had always possessed, beneath the ambition and the crimson dress and the sculpted diamonds, a precise and unsentimental instinct for self-preservation. The consulting contract was dissolved as part of the financial audit's resolution. Her company, the Delaware LLC, the neat vehicle of $3.7 million, was subject to a civil recovery claim that her attorney, in a formal letter to Marguerite's office, suggested settling without admission of liability. The settlement was reached in 6 weeks. The exact terms were confidential. What was not confidential, because it was simply observable to anyone who looked, was that Vivian Colt's name disappeared entirely from the industry. No new consulting clients emerged. No rebranding of her public profile. She did not give interviews or write essays about her experience. She withdrew with the quiet efficiency of smoke dissipating after a flame. Damien's situation was more complex, because Damien was not without talent, and Celine had never pretended otherwise. The financial audit concluded with the determination that the payments to Colt Advisory had been made with Damien's knowledge. Whether or not it constituted fraud in the legal sense was a matter the company's legal team addressed with the precision of people who understood that public litigation was not in anyone's interest. A resolution was reached that involved Damien's personal repayment of the funds over a structured period, without criminal proceeding. In exchange, his design role was formalized. He would remain as creative director of Harrington House, a title that was genuine and that reflected his actual contribution to the company's aesthetic identity. His executive authority was gone. His signatory status was gone. His name remained on the company, Harrington House, not Voss House, because Celine had never needed to put her name on the door to know it was her door, and it remained there because the talent was real and because a certain kind of dignity involves knowing the difference between a person's gift and their failure. He did not fight the restructuring publicly. His attorneys issued a brief statement about his new role and his commitment to the brand's creative vision. There was no counter-narrative. There was no press appearance. There was, eventually, a quiet interview with a design publication in which he spoke about his collections with the same genuine passion he had always had, and said nothing about the events of October, and was not asked about them by a journalist who clearly understood where the story lived and where it didn't. The office on the 42nd floor was now Celine's. She did not redecorate it. She moved the Esquire photograph on the boardroom wall and replaced it with photographs she had taken herself years ago, a wide shot of Harrington House headquarters at dawn, the building empty and still and lit from within by cleaning crews and overnight security. The building before the day began, the foundation of everything. She thought her mother would have liked that photograph. She placed it at exactly the right angle. 6 months after the board meeting, Harrington House hosted its annual spring preview in Milan. It was a different kind of event than the founding gala. Smaller, more intimate, attended by editors and buyers and the kind of quiet industry insiders who shape the direction of fashion in the years before the general public catches up. There was no ballroom, no string quartet, no seating chart studied like a treaty. There was a long, white room in a palazzo near Canal, and the clothes were extraordinary, and Damien's creative vision moved through them like something almost painfully alive, because whatever else was true about him, the talent had never been the question. Celine was there. She stood near the far end of the room, beside a window through which the late afternoon light fell in long gold columns that moved slowly across the floor as the event proceeded. She wore a coat from a new collection, deep green, beautifully structured, the kind of coat that looks like architecture and moves like water. Her hair was down, as it had been at the board meeting, because she had decided that was who she was now in rooms, fully visible, fully herself, no longer adjusting her presence to the comfort of those who had mistaken her quietness for smallness. She held a glass of water. She watched the room. Editors spoke to her directly now, not through Damien, not as an extension of his name. They sought her out with the specific, purposeful energy of people who had understood, belatedly, with the particular embarrassment of those who should have known sooner, that she was a conversation they had always needed to be having. A young journalist from a cultural magazine found her at the window and asked if she would speak on the record about her vision for Harrington House in the next 5 years. Celine looked at her for a moment, this young woman with her recorder and her careful questions, and thought about all the rooms in which no one had pointed a recorder in her direction. She felt no bitterness about those rooms. They had given her something that all the spotlight in the world could not have provided, the full, uninterrupted space to think, to build, to understand what she was making before she had to explain it to anyone. The vision, Celine said, has always been the same. We make things that last. We build relationships that are honest. We reward patience. She paused. The company has always known what it was. It's the world that needed time to catch up. The journalist wrote it down. The recorder caught every word. And Celine turned back to the window because the light was doing something beautiful over the canal, and she had always had the habit of paying attention to beautiful things. There's a particular kind of woman who builds empires in the background, who holds the structure while someone else stands at the center of it and takes the blows. She does this not out of weakness, not out of submission or fear or the absence of ambition, but out of the complexity of love and strategy and the quiet confidence of someone who knows that what she is building is real, and that real things do not require an audience to be true. These women are not uncommon. They exist in offices and in homes and in invisible spaces between the names on the masthead. They are the architects of things that carry other people's names. They are the authors of sentences that other people speak. And they endure not because they have no choice, but because they understand something about time that more impatient natures cannot grasp, that the moment of clarity always comes, not in drama, not in noise, but in the quiet accumulation of truth, pressing steadily against the surface of illusion until the illusion can no longer hold. Celine Voss Harrington had known who she was on the night. She sat at the east table of the Ardsley Grand Ballroom with the city's most powerful people swirling around her and no one looking in her direction. She had known who she was in the 42nd floor conference room when she had looked across the table at a man whose face she had loved and whose limitations she had finally stopped managing. She had known who she was in the Milan Palazzo as the light moved over her shoulders and the world finally arrived at the address she had occupied all along. She had always known. That, perhaps, was the source of her calm. Not distance, not coldness, not the absence of feeling, but the deep, settled certainty of a woman who has never truly been in doubt about her own worth, only about the length of time she was willing to allow others to forget it. She had waited. She had built. She had endured, without shrinking, without performing bitterness, without raising her voice in rooms that would have been satisfied by a performance of her pain. And when the moment came, she had not screamed, she had not wept, she had not spilled herself across the floor for people to step over. She had simply walked to the head of the table, sat down, opened the folder, and let the work speak for itself, because it always had. She stood at the window for a long time after the journalist left. Outside, the canal moved in its unhurried way, and the city of Milan continued its ancient, beautiful, entirely indifferent life around her, and the late gold light eventually softened into blue of early evening, and she finished her water and set the glass down on the windowsill with a gentle, final click, built on vision, held by patience. She had written those words on a cocktail napkin in a small apartment that smelled of turpentine and ambition. She had given them to a man she loved. He had put them on a plaque and hung them on a table and forgotten, over time, who had brought them into the world. She had remembered. She had always remembered. And that Above the 51%, above the board vote, above the financial audit and the restructuring, and the gray folders at 11 seats. That remembering was the real source of her power. No one could take from a woman what she never forgot she owned.